Ragnar, of course, won the drinking competition, and Raven recited a long poem about some ancient hero who killed a monster, and then the monster's mother, who was even more fearsome than her son. But I was too drunk to remember much of it. And after the Yule feast, I discovered something new about the Danes and their gods. For Ragnar had ordered a great pit dug in the woods above his house, and Rorik and I helped make the pit in a clearing. We axed through tree roots, shovelled out earth, and still Ragnar wanted it deeper, and he was only satisfied when he could stand in the base of the pit and not see across its lip. A ramp led down into the hole, beside which was a great heap of excavated soil. The next night, all Ragnar's men, but no women, walked to the pit in the darkness. We boys carried pitch-soaked torches that flamed under the trees, casting flickering shadows that melted into the surrounding darkness. The men were all dressed and armed as though they were going to war. Blind Raven waited at the pit, standing at the far side from the ramp, and he chanted a great epic in praise of Odin. On and on it went, the words as hard and rhythmic as a drumbeat, describing how the great god had made the world from the corpse of the giant Ymir, and how he had hurled the sun and moon into the sky, and how his spear, Gungnir, was the mightiest weapon in creation, forged by dwarves in the world's deeps. And on the poem went, and the men gathered around the pit seemed to sway to the poem's pulse, sometimes repeating a phrase, and I confess I was almost as bored as when Bjorka used to drone on in his stammering Latin. And I stared out into the woods, watching the shadows, wondering what things moved in the dark, and thinking of the Skir-Dugengan. I often thought of the Skir-Dugengan, the Shadow Walkers. Ealdwulf, Bebenberg's blacksmith, had first told me of them. He'd warned me not to tell Bjorka of the stories, and I never did. And Ealdwulf told me how, before Christ came to England, back when we English had worshipped Woden and the other gods, it had been well known that there were shadow walkers who moved silent and half-seen across the land. Mysterious creatures who could change their shapes. One moment they were wolves, then they were men, or perhaps eagles. And they were neither alive nor dead, but things from the shadow world, night beasts. And I stared into the dark trees, and I wanted there to be a Skir-Dugengan out there in the dark. Something that would be my secret, something that would frighten the Danes, something to give Bebenberg back to me, something as powerful as the magic which brought the Danes victory. It was a child's dream, of course. When you're young and powerless, you dream of possessing mystical strength. And once you're grown and strong, you condemn lesser folk to that same dream. But as a child, I wanted the power of the Skir-Dugengan. I remember my excitement that night at the notion of harnessing the power of the Shadow Walkers. Before a whinny brought my attention back to the pit, and I saw that the men at the ramp had divided, and that a strange procession was coming from the dark. There was a stallion, a ram, a dog, a goose, a bull, and a boar, each animal led by one of Ragnar's warriors, and at the back was an English prisoner, a man condemned for moving a field marker, and he, like the beasts, had a rope about his neck. I knew the stallion. It was Ragnar's finest, a great black horse called Flamestepper, a horse Ragnar loved. Yet Flamestepper, like all the other beasts, was to be given to Odin that night. Ragnar did it. Stripped to his waist, his scarred chest broad in the flame light, he used a war axe to kill the beasts one by one. And Flamestepper was the last animal to die, and the great horse's eyes were white as it was forced down the ramp. It struggled, terrified by the stench of blood that had splashed the sides of the pit, and Ragnar went to the horse, and there were tears on his face as he kissed Flamestepper's muzzle. And then he killed him. One blow between the eyes, straight and true, so that the stallion fell, hooves thrashing, but dead within a heartbeat. The man died last, and that was not so distressing as the horse's death. And then Ragnar stood in the mess of blood-matted fur and raised his gore-smothered axe to the sky. "Odin!" he shouted. "Odin!" Every man echoed the shout, and they held their swords or spears or axes towards the steaming pit. "Odin!" they shouted again. And I saw Wieland the snake staring at me across the fire-lit slaughter hall. All the corpses were taken from the pit and hung from tree branches. Their blood had been given to the creatures beneath the earth, and now their flesh was given to the gods above. And then we filled in the pit. We danced on it to stamp down the earth, and the jars of ale and skins of mead were handed around, and we drank beneath the hanging corpses. Odin, the terrible god, had been summoned because Ragnar and his people were going to war. I thought of the blades held over the pit of blood. I thought of the god stirring in his corpse hall to send a blessing on these men, and I knew that all England would fall unless it found a magic as strong as the sorcery of these strong men. I was only 10 years old, but on that night I knew what I would become. I would join the Skier Dugengan. I would be a shadow walker. Chapter 2. Springtime, the year 868. I was 11 years old, and the Wind Viper was afloat. She was afloat, but not at sea. The Wind Viper was Ragnar's ship, a lovely thing with a hull of oak, a carved serpent's head at the prow, an eagle's head at the stern, and a triangular wind vane made of bronze, on which a raven was painted black. The wind vane was mounted at her masthead, though the mast was now lowered and being supported by 2 timber crutches, so that it ran like a rafter down the centre of the longship. Ragnar's men were rowing, and their painted shields lined the ship's sides. They chanted as they rowed, pounding out the tale of how mighty Thor had fished for the dread Midgard serpent that lies coiled about the roots of the world, and how the serpent had taken the hook baited with an ox's head, and how the giant Hymir, terrified of the vast snake, had cut the line. It's a good tale, and its rhythms took us up the river Trent, which is a tributary of the Humber and flows from deep inside Mercia. We were going south, against the current, but the journey was easy, the ride placid, the sun warm and the river's margins thick with flowers. Some men rode horses, keeping pace with us on the eastern bank, while behind us was a fleet of beast-proud ships. This was the army of Ivar the Boneless and Uber the Horrible, a host of Northmen, sword-danes, going to war. All eastern Northumbria belonged to them. Western Northumbria offered grudging allegiance, and now they planned to take Mercia, which was the kingdom at England's heartland. The Mercian territory stretched south to the river Thames, where the lands of Wessex began, west to the mountainous country where the Welsh tribes lived, and east to the farms and marshes of East Anglia. Mercia, though not as wealthy as Wessex, was much richer than Northumbria, and the River Trent ran into the kingdom's heart, and the Wind Viper was the tip of a Danish spear aimed at that heart. The river was not deep, but Ragnar boasted that the Wind Viper could float on a puddle, and that was almost true. From a distance she looked long, lean, and knife-like, but when you were aboard, you could see how the midships flared outwards so that she sat on the water like a shallow bowl, rather than cut through it like a blade. And even with her belly laden with 40 or 50 men, their weapons, shields, food, and ale, she needed very little depth. Once in a while her long keel would scrape on gravel, but by keeping to the outside of the river's sweeping bends, we were able to stay in sufficient water. That was why the mast had been lowered. so that on the outside of the river's curves we could slide under the overhanging trees without becoming entangled. Rorik and I sat in the prow with his grandfather, Raven, and our job was to tell the old man everything we could see, which was very little, other than flowers, trees, reeds, waterfowl, and the signs of trout rising to mayfly. Swallows had come from their winter sleep and swooped across the river, while martins pecked at the banks to collect mud for their nests. Warblers were loud, pigeons clattered through new leaves, and the hawks slid still and menacing across the scattered clouds. Swans watched us pass, and once in a while we would see otter cubs playing beneath the pale-leaved willows, and there would be a flurry of water as they fled from our coming. Sometimes we passed a riverside settlement of thatch and timber, but the folks and their livestock had already run away. "Mercia is frightened of us," Raven said. He lifted his white, blind eyes to the oncoming air. "And they are right to be frightened. We are warriors." "They have warriors too," I said. Raven laughed. "I think only 1 man in 3 is a warrior, and sometimes not even that many. But in our army, Uhtred, every man is a fighter. If you do not want to be a warrior, you stay home in Denmark. You till the soil, herd sheep, fish the sea, but you do not take to the ships and become a fighter. But here, in England, every man is forced to fight. Yet only 1 in 3, or maybe only 1 in 4, has the belly for it. The rest are farmers who just want to run. We are wolves fighting sheep." "Watch and learn," my father had said. And I was learning. What else can a boy with an unbroken voice do? 1 in 3 men are warriors. Remember the shadow walkers. Beware the cut beneath the shield. A river can be an army's road to a kingdom's heart. Watch and learn. "And they have a weak king," Raven went on. "Burgred, he's called, and he has no guts for a fight. He will fight, of course, because we shall force him, and he will call on his friends in Wessex to help him. But in his weak heart, he knows he cannot win." "How do you know?" Rorik asked. Raven smiled. "All winter, boy. Our traders have been in Mercia selling pelts, selling amber, buying iron ore, buying malt. And they talk, and they listen, and they come back, and they tell us what they heard." Kill the traders, I thought. Why did I think that way? I liked Ragnar. I liked him much more than I'd like my father. I should by rights be dead, yet Ragnar had saved me, and Ragnar spoilt me, and he treated me like a son, and he called me a Dane, and I liked the Danes. Yet even at that time, I knew I was not a Dane. I was Uhtred of Bebbanburg, and I clung to the memory of the fortress by the sea, of the birds crying over the breakers, of the puffins whirring across the whitecaps, of the seals on the rocks, of the white water shattering on the cliffs. I remembered the folk of that land, the men who had called my father Lord, but talked to him of cousins they held in common. It was the gossip of neighbours, the comfort of knowing every family within a half-day's ride, and that was and is Bebbanburg to me. Home. Ragnar would have given me the fortress if it could be taken, but then it would belong to the Danes, and I would be nothing more than their hired man, ealdorman at their pleasure, no better than King Egbert, who was no king but a pampered dog on a short rope, and what the Danes give, the Danes can take away. And I would hold Bebbanburg by my own effort. Did I know all that at 11? Some, I think. It lay in my heart, unformed, unspoken, but hard as a stone. It would be covered over in time, half forgotten and often contradicted, but it was always there. Destiny is all, Raven liked to tell me. Destiny is everything. He would even say it in English. Weird byth full arid.
What are you thinking?
Rorik asked me. That it would be nice to swim, I said. The oars dipped, and the Wind Viper glided on into Mercia. Next day, a small force waited in our path. The Mercians had blocked the river with felled trees, which did not quite bar the way, but would certainly make it hard for our oarsmen to make progress through the small gap between the tangling branches. There were about 100 Mercians, and they had a score of bowmen and spear-throwers waiting by the blockage, ready to pick off our rowers, while the rest of their men were formed into a shield wall on the eastern bank. Ragnar laughed when he saw them. That was something else I learned. The joy with which the Danes faced battle. Ragnar was whooping with joy as he leaned on the steering oar and ran the ship into the bank, and the ships behind were also grounding themselves, while the horsemen who had been keeping pace with us dismounted for battle. I watched from the Wind Viper's prow as the ship's crews hurried ashore and pulled on leather or mail. What did those Mercians see? They saw young men with wild hair, wild beards, and hungry faces. Men who embraced battle like a lover. If the Danes could not fight an enemy, they fought amongst themselves. Most had nothing but monstrous pride, battle scars, and well-sharpened weapons, and with those things they would take whatever they wanted. And that Mercian shield wall did not even stay to contest the fight. But once they saw they would be outnumbered, they ran away to the mocking howls of Ragnar's men, who then stripped off their mail and leather and used their axes and the Wind Viper's hide-twisted ropes to clear away the fallen trees. It took a few hours to unblock the river, but then we were moving again. That night, the ships clustered together on the riverbank. Fires were lit ashore. Men were posted as sentries, and every sleeping warrior kept his weapons beside him. But no one troubled us, and at dawn we moved on, soon coming to a town with thick earthen walls and a high palisade. This, Ragnar assumed, was the place the Mercians had failed to defend, but there seemed to be no sign of any soldiers on the wall, so he ran the boat ashore again and led his crew towards the town. The earth walls and timber palisade were both in good condition, and Ragnar marvelled that the town's garrison had chosen to march downriver to fight us, rather than stay behind their well-tended defences. The Mercian soldiers were plainly gone now, probably fled south, for the gates were open, and a dozen townsfolk were kneeling outside the wooden arch and holding out supplicant hands for mercy. 3 of the terrified people were monks, their tonsured heads bowed. "I hate monks," Ragnar said cheerfully. His sword, Heartbreaker, was in his hand, and he swept her naked blade in a hissing arc. "Why?" I asked. "Monks are like ants," he said, "wriggling about in black, being useless. I hate them. You'll speak for me, Uhtred. Ask them what place this is." I asked and learned that the town was called Gainsborough. "Tell them," Ragnar instructed me, "that my name is Earl Ragnar. I am called the Fearless, and that I eat children when I'm not given food and silver." I duly told them. The kneeling men looked up at Ragnar, who had unbound his hair, which, had they known, was always a sign that he was in a mood for killing. His grinning men made a line behind him, a line heavy with axes, swords, spears, shields, and war hammers. "What food there is," I translated a grey-bearded man's answer, "is yours, but he says there's not much food." Ragnar smiled at that, stepped forward and, still smiling, swung Heartbreaker so that her blade half severed the man's head. I jumped back, not in alarm, but because I did not want my tunic spattered with his blood. "One less mouth to feed," Ragnar said cheerfully. "Now ask the others how much food there is." The grey-bearded man was now red-bearded, and he was choking and twitching as he died. His struggles slowly ended, and then he just lay, dying, his eyes gazing reprovingly into mine. None of his companions tried to help him. They were too frightened. "How much food do you have?" I demanded. "There is food, Lord," one of the monks said. "How much?" I demanded again. "Enough." "He says there's enough," I told Ragnar. "A sword," Ragnar said, "is a great tool for discovering the truth. What about the monk's church? How much silver does it have?" The monk gabbled that we could look for ourselves, that we could take whatever we found, that it was all ours. Anything we found was ours, all was ours. I translated these panicked statements, and Ragnar smiled again. "He's not telling the truth, is he?" "Isn't he?" I asked. "He wants me to look because he knows I won't find, and that means they've hidden their treasure or had it taken away. Ask him if they've hidden their silver." I did, and the monk reddened. "We are a poor church," he said, "with little treasure." And he stared wide-eyed as I translated his answer. Then he tried to get up and run, as Ragnar stepped forward, but he tripped over his robe, and Heartbreaker pierced his spine so that he jerked like a landed fish as he died. There was silver, of course, and it was buried. Another of the monks told us so, and Ragnar sighed as he cleaned his sword on the dead monk's robe. "They're such fools," he said plaintively. "They'd live if they answered truthfully the first time." "But suppose there wasn't any treasure?" I asked him. "Then they'd tell the truth and die," Ragnar said, and found that funny. "But what's the point of a monk, except to hoard treasure for us Danes? They're ants who hoard silver. Find the ant's nest and dig, and a man is rich." He stepped over his victims. At first I was shocked by the ease with which he would kill a defenceless man. But Ragnar had no respect for folk who cringed and lied. He appreciated an enemy who fought, who showed spirit, but many were weakly sly, like the ones he killed at Ginnisbur's gate, were beneath his contempt, no better than animals. We emptied Gainsborough of food, then made the monks dig up their treasure. It was not much. 2 silver mass cups, 3 silver plates, a bronze crucifix, and a silver Christ, a bone carving of angels climbing a ladder, and a bag of silver pennies. Ragnar distributed the coins among his men, then hacked the silver plates and cups to pieces with an axe and shared out the scraps. He had no use for the bone carving, so shattered it with his sword. "A weird religion," he said. "They worship just one god?" "One god," I said. "But he's divided into 3. He liked that. "Clever trick," he said, "but not useful. This triple god has a mother, doesn't he?" "Mary," I said, following him as he explored the monastery in search of more plunder. "I wonder if her baby came out in 3 bits, he said. "So what's this god's name?" "Don't know." I knew he had a name because Bjorka had told me, but I couldn't remember it. "The 3 together are the Trinity," I went on. "But that's not God's name. Usually they just call him God." "Like giving a dog the name Dog," Ragnar declared, then laughed. "So who is Jesus?" "One of the 3. "The one who died, yes? And he came back to life?" "Yes," I said, suddenly fearful that the Christian God was watching me, readying a dreadful punishment for my sins. "Gods can do that," Ragnar said airily. "They die, come back to life. They're gods." He looked at me, sensing my fear, and ruffled my hair. "Don't you worry, Uhtred. The Christian God doesn't have power here." "He doesn't?" "Of course not." He was searching a shed at the back of the monastery, and found a decent sickle that he tucked into his belt. "Gods fight each other. Everyone knows that. Look at our gods. The Aesir and Vanir fought like cats before they made friends." The Aesir and the Vanir were the two families of Danish gods who now shared Asgard, though at one time they had been the bitterest of enemies. "Gods fight," Ragnar went on earnestly, "and some win, some lose. The Christian God is losing, otherwise why would we be here? Why would we be winning? The gods reward us if we give them respect, but the Christian God doesn't help his people, does he? They weep rivers of tears for him, they pray to him, they give him their silver, and we come along and slaughter them. Their God is pathetic. If he had any real power, then we wouldn't be here, would we?" It seemed an unassailable logic to me. What was the point of worshipping a god if he did not help you? And it was incontrovertible that the worshippers of Odin and Thor were winning, and I surreptitiously touched the hammer of Thor hanging from my neck as we returned to the Wind Viper. We left Gainsborough ravaged, its folk weeping and its storehouses emptied, and we rowed on down the wide river, the belly of our boat piled with grain, bread, salted meat, and smoked fish. Later, much later, I learned that Ealhswith, King Alfred's wife, had come from Gainsborough. Her father, the man who had failed to fight us, was ealdorman there, and she had grown up in the town, and always lamented that, after she had left, the Danes had sacked the place. God, she always declared, would have his revenge on the pagans who had ravaged her hometown, and it seemed wise not to tell her that I had been one of the ravagers. We ended the voyage at a town called Snottingaham, which means the home of Snot's people, and it was a much greater place than Gainsborough, but its garrison had fled, and those people who remained welcomed the Danes with piles of food and heaps of silver. There would have been time for a horseman to reach Snottingaham with news of Gainsborough's dead, and the Danes were always happy for such messengers to spread fear of their coming, and so the larger town, with its walls, fell without a fight. Some ships' crews were ordered to man the walls, while others raided the countryside. The first thing they sought was more horses, and when the war bands were mounted, they ranged farther afield, stealing, burning, and harrowing the land. "We shall stay here," Ragnar told me. "All summer?" "Till the world ends, Uhtred. This is Danish land now." At winter's end, Ivar and Uber had sent 3 ships back to the Danish homeland to encourage more settlers, and those new ships began arriving in 1s and 2s, bringing men, women, and children. The newcomers were allowed to take whatever houses they wished, except for those few that belonged to the Mercian leaders who had bent the knee to Ivar and Uber. One of those was the bishop, a young man called Ethelbrid, who preached to his congregations that God had sent the Danes. He never said why God had done this, and perhaps he did not know, but the sermons meant that his wife and children lived and his house was safe, and his church was allowed to retain 1 silver mass cup, though Ivar insisted that the bishop's twin sons be held as hostages in case the Christian God changed his mind about the Danes. Ragnar, like the other Danish leaders, constantly rode out into the country to bring back food, and he liked me to go with him, for I could translate for him. And as the days passed, we heard more and more stories of a great Mercian army gathering to the south at Ledecester, which Ragnar said was the greatest fortress in Mercia. It had been made by the Romans, who built better than any man could build now, and Burgred, Mercia's king, was assembling his forces there, and that was why Ragnar was so intent on gathering food. "They'll besiege us," he said. But we'll win, and then Leicester will be ours, and so will Mercia." He spoke very calmly, as though there could be no possibility of defeat. Rorik stayed in the town while I rode with his father. That was because Rorik was sick again, struck by cramping pains in his belly so severe that he was sometimes reduced to helpless tears. He vomited in the night, was pale, and the only relief came from a brew of herbs made for him by an old woman who was a servant of the bishop. Ragnar worried about Rorik, yet he was pleased that his son and I were such good friends. Rorik did not question his father's fondness for me, nor was he jealous. In time, he knew, Ragnar planned to take me back to Bebbanburg, and I would be given my patrimony, and he assumed I would stay his friend, and so Bebbanburg would become a Danish stronghold. I would be Earl Uhtred, and Rorik and his older brother would hold other strongholds, and Ragnar would be a great lord, supported by his sons and by Bebbanburg, and we would all be Danes, and Odin would smile on us, and so the world would go on until the final conflagration, when the great gods fought the monsters and the army of the dead would march from Valhalla, and the underworld give up its beasts, and fire would consume the great tree of life, Yggdrasil. In other words, everything would stay the same until it was all no more. That was what Rorik thought, and doubtless Ragnar thought so too. Destiny, Raven said, is everything. News came in the high summer that the Mercian army was marching at last, and that King Ethelred of Wessex was bringing his army to support Burgred, and so we were to be faced by 2 of the 3 remaining English kingdoms. We stopped our raids into the countryside and readied Snottingaham for the inevitable siege. The palisade on the earth wall was strengthened, and the ditch outside the wall was deepened. The ships were drawn up on the town's riverbank, far from the walls, so they could not be reduced to ash by fire arrows shot from outside the defences, and the thatch of the buildings closest to the wall was pulled off the houses, so that they could not be set ablaze. Ivar and Uber had decided to endure a siege because they reckoned we were strong enough to hold what we had taken, but that if we took more territory then, the Danish forces would be stretched thin and could be defeated piece by piece. It was better, they reckoned, to let the enemy come and break himself on Snottingaham's defences. That enemy came as the poppies bloomed. The Mercian scouts arrived first, small groups of horsemen who circled the town warily, and at midday Burgred's foot soldiers appeared, band after band of men, with spears, axes, swords, sickles, and hay-knives. They camped well away from the walls, using branches and turf to make a township of crude shelters that sprang up across the low hills and meadows. Snottingaham lay on the north bank of the Trent, which meant the river was between the town and the rest of Mercia. But the enemy army came from the west, having crossed the Trent somewhere to the south of the town. A few of their men stayed on the southern bank to make sure our ships did not cross the river to land men for foraging expeditions, and the presence of those men meant that the enemy surrounded us. But they made no attempt to attack us. The Mercians were waiting for the West Saxons to come, and in that first week the only excitement occurred when a handful of Burgred's archers crept towards the town and loosed a few arrows at us, and the missiles whacked into the palisade and stuck there, perches for birds. And that was the extent of their belligerence. After that, they fortified their camp, surrounding it with a barricade of felled trees and thorn bushes. "They're frightened that we'll make a sally and kill them all," Ragnar said. "So they're going to sit there and try to starve us out." "Will they?" I asked. "They couldn't starve a mouse in a pot," Ragnar said cheerfully. He had hung his shield on the outer side of the palisade, one of over 1,200 bright-painted shields which were displayed there. We did not have 1,200 men, but nearly all the Danes possessed more than one shield, and they hung them all on the wall to make the enemy think our garrison equalled the number of shields. The great lords among the Danes hung their banners on the wall, Uber's raven flag and Ragnar's eagle wing among them. The raven banner was a triangle of white cloth fringed with white tassels, showing a black raven with spread wings, while Ragnar's standard was a real eagle's wing nailed to a pole, and it was becoming so tattered that Ragnar had offered a golden arm ring to any man who could replace it. "If they want us out of here," he went on, "then they'd best make an assault, and they'd best do it in the next 3 weeks before their men go home and cut their harvest." But the Mercians, instead of attacking, tried to pray us out of Snottingaham. A dozen priests, all robed and carrying cross-tipped poles, and followed by a score of monks carrying sacred banners on cross-staffs, came out from behind their barricades and paraded just beyond bowshot. The flags showed saints. One of the priests scattered holy water, and the whole group stopped every few yards to pronounce curses on us. That was the day the West Saxon forces arrived to support Burgred, whose wife was sister to Alfred and to King Ethelred of Wessex. And that was the first day I ever saw the dragon standard of Wessex. It was a huge banner of heavy green cloth, on which a white dragon breathed fire, and the standard-bearer galloped to catch up with the priests, and the dragon streamed behind him. "Your turn will come," Ragnar said quietly, talking to the rippling dragon. "When?" "The gods only know," Ragnar said, still watching the standard. "This year we should finish off Mercia, then we'll go to East Anglia, and after that Wessex, to take all the land and treasure in England, Uhtred. 3 years? 4? We need more ships, though." He meant we needed more ships' crews, more shield danes, more swords. "Why not go north?" I asked him. "To Dalriada and Pictland." He laughed. "There's nothing up there, Uhtred, except bare rocks, bare fields, and bare arses. The land there is no better than at home." He nodded out towards the enemy encampment. "But this is good land, rich and deep. You can raise children here. You can grow strong here." He fell silent as a group of horsemen appeared from the enemy camp and followed the rider who carried the dragon standard. Even from a long way off, it was possible to see that these were great men, for they rode splendid horses and had mail coats glinting beneath their dark red cloaks. "The King of Wessex," Ragnar guessed. "Ethelred?" "It's probably him. We shall find out now." "Find out what?" "What these West Saxons are made of. The Mercians won't attack us, so let's see if Ethelred's men are any better. Dawn, Uhtred. That's when they should come. Straight at us. Ladders against the wall, lose some men, but let the rest slaughter us." He laughed. "That's what I'd do. But that lot?" He spat in derision. Ivar and Uber must have thought the same thing, for they sent 2 men to spy on the Mercian and West Saxon forces to see if there was any sign that ladders were being made. The 2 men went out at night and were supposed to skirt the besiegers' encampment and find a place to watch the enemy from outside their fortifications. But somehow they were both seen and caught. The 2 men were brought to the fields in front of the wall and made to kneel there with their hands tied behind their backs. A tall Englishman stood behind them with a drawn sword, and I watched as he poked one of the Danes in the back, as the Dane lifted his head, and then as the sword swung. The second Dane died in the same way, and the 2 bodies were left for the ravens to eat. "Bastards," Ragnar said. Ivar and Uber had also watched the executions. I rarely saw the brothers. Uber stayed in his house much of the time, while Ivar, so thin and wraith-like, was more evident, pacing the walls every dawn and dusk, scowling at the enemy and saying little, though now he spoke urgently to Ragnar, gesturing south to the green fields beyond the river. He never seemed to speak without a snarl, but Ragnar was not offended. "He's angry," he told me afterwards, "because he needs to know if they plan to assault us. Now he wants some of my men to spy on their camp. But after that—" He nodded at the two headless bodies in the field. "Maybe I'd better go myself." "They'll be watching for more spies," I said, not wanting Ragnar to end up headless before the walls. "A leader leads," Ragnar said, "and you can't ask men to risk death if you're not willing to risk it yourself." "Let me go," I said. He laughed at that. "What kind of leader sends a boy to do a man's job, eh?" "I'm English," I said, "and they won't suspect an English boy." Ragnar smiled at me. "If you're English," he said, "then how could we trust you to tell us the truth of what you see?" I clutched Thor's hammer. "I will tell the truth," I said. "I swear it. And I'm a Dane now. You've told me that. You say I'm a Dane." Ragnar began to take me seriously. He knelt to look into my face. "Are you really a Dane?" he asked. "I'm a Dane," I said. And at that moment, I meant it. At other times I was sure I was a Northumbrian, a secret Skier Dugengan, hidden among the Danes, and in truth I was confused. I loved Ragnar as a father, was fond of Raven, wrestled and raced and played with Rorik when he was well enough, and all of them treated me as one of them. I was just from another tribe. There were three main tribes among the Northmen, the Danes, the Norse, and the Sphere, but Ragnar said there were others, like the Getes, and he was not sure where the Northmen ended and the others began. But suddenly he was worried about me. "I'm a Dane," I repeated forcibly. "And who better than me to spy on them? I speak their language." "You're a boy," Ragnar said, and I thought he was refusing to let me go, but instead he was getting used to the idea. "No one will suspect a boy," he went on. He still stared at me, then stood and glanced again at the two bodies where ravens were pecking at the severed heads. "Are you sure, Uhtred?" "I'm sure." "I'll ask the brothers," he said. And he did. And Ivar and Uber must have agreed, for they let me go. It was after dark when the gate was opened and I slipped out. Now, I thought, I am a shadow walker at last. Though in truth the journey needed no supernatural skills, for there was a slew of campfires in the Mercian and West Saxon lines to light the way. Ragnar had advised me to skirt the big encampment and see if there was an easy way in at the back,